Welcome to another exciting fantastic episode of Pocket Pulp! Okay, I need to cut back on the coffee. But it is a fantastic episode. Today we have All Deaths Endure, an Anne Kinnear suspense short by Matty Dalrymple. Matty is the author of the Lizzie Ballard thrillers, such as Rock, Paper, Scissors, Snake and Ladders, and The Iron Ring, and the Anne Kinnear suspense novels, The Sense of Death, The Sense of Reckoning, The Falcon and the Owl, and A Furnace for Your Foe, as well as the Anne Kinnear suspense shorts, including Close These Eyes and Right in Water and more. So if you like what we're doing here today, there's a lot more Anne Kinnear out there for you to get your hands on, or your eyes on, or your imagination on, or whatever you want. And I'll drop links to all of that in the notes. Matty lives with her husband and their dogs in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and enjoys vacationing on Mount Desert Island, Maine, and Sedona, Arizona, and these locations provide the settings for her work. To know more about Matty, check out her website, mattydalrymple.com, or follow her on Twitter at Matty Dalrymple, or on Facebook, Matty Dalrymple, you guessed it, and I will put all those links in the notes. And if you are enjoying Pocket Pulp, and I hope you are, then I hope you subscribe, you rate, you tell some people. Let's get this thing going. All right, I'm excited. Let's get into it. And now, All Deaths Endure, an Anne Kinnear suspense short, written by Matty Dalrymple, read by Eric Brian Moore. So dear I love him, that with him all deaths I could endure. Without him, live no life. John Milton, Paradise Lost. At a few minutes before 6:30, the chime of the doorbell echoed down the main hall to the dining room. Andrews made a fine adjustment to the silverware at one of the 3 place settings, tugged down the vest of his black suit, and walked briskly to the foyer. He opened the door to a 30-ish woman with reddish blonde hair, a wisp of which had come loose from the clip which held it back from her pale face. A few flakes of mid-February snow drifted down in the darkness behind her. "Good evening, miss," he said, stepping aside. "Please come in." "Thank you." She stepped into the foyer, looking, as she had at the time of her last visit a year ago, a bit reluctant. "May I take your coat?" he asked. "Thanks." She unbuttoned the coat and turned to let him ease it from her shoulders. She was wearing a dark blue silk dress with a silver necklace and earrings. He recalled that she had worn the same dress the previous year. It was well made, but, he noted, now slightly large for her slender figure. He hung her coat in a small closet screened from the rest of the foyer by an antique Chinese screen. He emerged and gave her a slight bow. "Mrs. Phipps invites you to wait in the library until dinner?" She nodded, rubbing her arms. Andrews had to admit that the foyer wasn't particularly warm. The cost to heat the entire house was prohibitive. He led her down the central hallway that joined the 2-story foyer at the front of the house with the conservatory in the back. He turned into a doorway halfway down the hall and stepped aside to let her enter. A fire crackling in the fireplace held the chill of the foyer and hallway at bay. He had laid the fire himself just before setting the table for dinner. "Macallan on the rocks?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." "1 rock," he amended. She smiled and nodded. "Dinner at 7. I'll take you to the dining room at 6:55, he said, just as the clock on the mantel began to chime half past the hour. "All right." He closed the door behind him as he left the library. He had already retrieved the Macallan from the liquor cabinet. He put 1 ice cube, pleasingly clear since he had boiled the water, in a heavy crystal tumbler, then added 2 shots of scotch. He placed the glass on a small silver tray and headed back to the library. She was standing in front of the fireplace, her arms crossed, gazing into the flames. She started slightly when he cleared his throat to announce his presence. He placed a cocktail napkin on the table closest to where she stood and put her drink on it. "Please make yourself comfortable until dinner is served." "Thank you." She was taking the first swallow of her drink as he eased the door shut. He returned to the kitchen to make the final preparations for dinner. At the appointed time, he returned to the library. She was standing by the fire. The tumbler was empty. "Please follow me, miss." She smoothed her dress and followed him into the hall and from there to the dining room. Candles flickered on the table, casting shadows onto the coffered ceiling. The centerpiece was a small arrangement of tulips, cut short so as not to interfere with the diner's conversation. He had removed the leaves from the long table to make it as small and intimate as possible. It was a logistical feat for one person that was getting more difficult to perform with each passing year. He had set 3 places, one each at the head and foot of the table and one at the side. "Please have a seat, miss. Mrs. Phipps will be in shortly." She sat at the side of the table and folded her hands in her laps. Andrews took his place in the corner. The ticking of the clock seemed loud in the large room. Just as the clock struck 7, Andrews heard the accustomed tapping on the parquet floor of the hallway. In a moment, Annalise Phipps appeared in the doorway. Her white hair was coiffed into a perfect and sedate swirl above her fine-featured face. Her pink wool dress as flattering to her petite figure now as it had been when it had been made for her 3 decades before, accentuating the pinkness of her cheeks. He had retrieved her pearl necklace from the safe deposit box at the bank that afternoon. The cane she carried was more of an accessory than a crutch. She nodded to him. "Good evening, Andrews." "Good evening, ma'am." She crossed the room to the foot of the table. Andrews followed her and pulled out her chair, then adjusted it to her preferred distance from the table. She shook out the linen napkin. The young woman did the same. "You may serve dinner now, Andrews," Mrs. Phipps said. He passed through the short hallway that led from the dining room to the kitchen and opened the oven. Inside were 3 plates topped with metal covers. He put the plates onto a tray and made his careful way back to the dining room. He placed the tray on the sideboard and transferred the plates to the table one at a time, the first to the empty seat at the head of the table, the second to Mrs. Phipps, the third to the young woman. Then he returned to each plate and removed the cover to reveal pork chops, mashed potatoes, and steamed broccoli. Mrs. Phipps picked up her heavy silver knife and fork and fingers misshapen by arthritis and sliced off a tiny piece of pork chop. She chewed thoughtfully, then patted her mouth with her napkin. "Excellent, as always, Andrews." "Thank you, ma'am." "What do you think of it, my dear?" asked Mrs. Phipps. The young woman scooped up a small portion of mashed potatoes, swallowed, and said, "As you say, excellent, as always." Mrs. Phipps smiled at the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. "I'm so glad you like it, my dear. Do you know what today is?" "It's Valentine's Day, and our anniversary," said the young woman. "That's right, it is. Happy anniversary, sweetheart." "Happy anniversary," said the young woman. "My love," she added. Mrs. Phipps' smile deepened. She cut off another tiny slice of pork chop, chewed and swallowed, and patted her mouth with the napkin again. "I can't believe it's been a whole year, my dear. I have a great deal of news for you." "Oh, yes?" asked the young woman, a hint of trepidation tinging her voice. "I'm looking forward to hearing what has been happening." Mrs. Phipps launched into her report of the last year's activities. There are stories of country club dinners, weddings of friends' grandchildren, and a brief trip to Marco Island in December. The young woman nodded and commented, encouraged and, where appropriate, managed an appreciative laugh. As the dinner progressed, her demeanor changed from tense and guarded to cautiously relieved. By the time Andrews returned to the dining room with dessert, the chocolate cake he had purchased that afternoon at Wegmans, she was looking merely tired. The clock struck 8. Mrs. Phipps applied the napkin to her mouth a final time and set it aside. "Andrews?" He stepped up to her chair and slid it back from the table. She stood and looked toward the empty chair at the head of the table, her eyes brightening with tears. "I must leave now, my dear. I wish we could talk more, but I must admit I'm quite spent. I am so happy to have been able to update you on what's been going on. Happy Valentine's Day, and happy anniversary." She raised her hand to her mouth and blew a discreet kiss toward the head of the table. "I'm so happy to have been able to speak with you too, my love," said the young woman. Annalise Phipps looked toward the empty chair for a few more seconds, a sad smile on her face, then turned and made her way to the door. Andrews stepped ahead of her to open it. "Thank you, Andrews," she said. "My compliments to the chef," she added playfully. "Thank you, ma'am." When he turned back to the table, the young woman was already standing. He glanced at her plate. She hadn't touched her dessert, or he noted much of the entree. "Is there anything I can get for you that would be more to your liking, miss?" "No, thank you," she said. "It was all very good. I'm just not very hungry." "Certainly, miss." He stood aside as she stepped out of the dining room into the hallway and preceded him to the foyer. He helped her on with her coat, then pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "Please accept this small token of Mrs. Phipps's appreciation," he said, as he always did. She took the envelope. "Thank you, Andrews." He knew she wouldn't cash the check. She never did. It had been 4 years earlier that he had handed the young woman a check for the first time. Her hand had shaken slightly as she took it. She had arrived at 6:30 and parked her car under the porte-cochere as he had requested. At one time, there had been a chauffeur who had dealt with visitors' cars, but he had left many years ago for a job in Atlantic City, and Andrews felt uncomfortable driving Mrs. Phipps's car, a 20-year-old Lincoln Town car, let alone anyone else's. That night it had been not snow, but sleety rain forming the backdrop of the young woman's arrival. He opened the door as she approached it. "Good evening, miss. My name is Andrews. Please, come in." She stepped into the foyer. "Andrews?" she asked. "Just Andrews?" "Yes, miss." "That's very upstairs downstairs," she said, her mouth beginning to twitch into a smile. He drew himself up to his full height. "May I take your coat, miss?" he asked severely. He was gratified to see that she seemed to tamp down the smile. He hung the coat behind the screen, then led her to the crackling fire in the library and asked her if she would like a cocktail. "Scotch?" she asked. "Certainly, miss. Do you have a preferred brand?" "Macallan?" "Of course." His humor improved. He prided himself on the Scotch selection in the liquor cabinet, some bottles of which dated back to when he had first stocked it 40 years before, and she had redeemed herself somewhat by her choice. He ascertained her preference for a single ice cube, went to the butler's pantry where the liquor was stored, then returned to the library with the drink on a tray. He put the drink atop a cocktail napkin on the table nearest to where she was standing. "Ah, I see you've found the music box, miss." "Yes, it's lovely," she said. Does it work?" "Of course." He reached out and gently moved a lever on the side of the ornately carved wooden case. A metal disc mounted atop the machine, like a warped and perforated album, began to rotate, and in a moment the first notes of the Blue Danube Waltz filled the room. "Built in 1898, he said. "All original, never restored." She laughed lightly, delighted. They listened until the song finished. "It's wonderful," she said. He nodded, pleased. "Your husband explained to you about Mrs. Phipps's preference for this engagement?" "Actually, he's my brother. He's also my business manager. He said that Mrs. Phipps is interested in speaking with her husband." "Yes. And the, logistics of the situation? He explained that as well?" "He said it would be over dinner. I understand that today is their anniversary?" "Yes. Well..." He was unsure exactly what Mrs. Phipps's conversation with the brother had been. Mrs. Phipps had gotten the young woman's name from a friend at the country club and had made the phone call herself. He nodded. "I have a few items to attend to, but I'll be back at 5 till 7 to take you to the dining room." He tipped her a small bow, and she raised her glass to him. He returned to the kitchen to complete the dinner preparations. It had been pork chops that night as well, he recalled. At the appointed time, he led her to the dining room and seated her at the side of the table, then took his place in the corner. "This is a beautiful room," she said. "It is," he said. He was glad that the low light of the candles hid the stains left on the wallpaper from an apparently unfixable leak and the faded silk of the drapes. At least the silver was brightly shined and the crystal buffed. He thought the table looked especially handsome in the flickering light. "Have you worked for Mrs. Phipps for a long time?" "Yes, quite a long time." She appeared to be about to pose another question, then evidently changed her mind. They sat in silence as 1 minute and then 2 ticked by. At 7 o'clock, Mrs. Phipps arrived, gave her permission for dinner to be served, and declared it to be delicious. "How is your pork chop, my dear?" asked Mrs. Phipps, looking toward the empty seat at the head of the table. The young woman looked at the seat as well, then at Mrs. Phipps, who was gazing expectantly at the empty chair, then at Andrews. He gave her a discreet, but he hoped, encouraging nod. It's very good," she said uncertainly. "Especially the potatoes?" Mrs. Phipps nibbled a delicate forkful of the mashed potatoes and nodded. "Yes." She turned to Andrews. "Very nicely done, Andrews." "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Phipps put her fork down, clasped her hands in her lap, and leaned forward. "I know we're here to celebrate our anniversary, my dear," she said to the empty chair. "But I'm afraid there's something quite serious I must discuss with you." A silence strung out, the only sound the harsh tick of the clock. Andrews tried to catch the young woman's eye, but she was glancing around the room. Finally, he cleared his throat. She looked toward him, and he gestured toward the empty chair with his head. She looked from the empty chair to Mrs. Phipps, whose posture hadn't changed, but whose expression was beginning to look a bit strained. She looked back at Andrews and pointed to herself and then to the chair. "Should I move over there?" "There's something that Mrs. Phipps would like to discuss with you," he said in a stage whisper, then nodded encouragingly. "Okay," she said uncertainly. He nodded more vigorously. She cleared her throat. "I'm very interested in hearing what you have to discuss," she said to Mrs. Phipps. The older woman's brow cleared. "You're so thoughtful to listen to my silly concerns, my dear." She fiddled with her teaspoon. "I'm afraid Roger is being somewhat irresponsible." The young woman shot a confused look at Andrews. "It's so unfortunate that your son would cause you any concern, ma'am," he said. Mrs. Phipps glanced at him in surprise, then said somewhat reproachfully, "Perhaps you could refill the water glasses, Andrews?" He flushed. No one had yet drunk from the water glasses. He picked up the carafe from the sideboard and added a minuscule amount of water to each glass. "Thank you, Andrews," she said, clearly feeling she had made her point about such interruptions. She returned her attention to the head of the table. "As I was saying, it's Roger. He's being somewhat excessive in his spending." After a moment, the young woman said, "I'm sorry to hear that." "He means well, of course, but he's spending beyond his allowance." "Allowance?" "Of course." "How old is Roger?" Andrews shook his head vigorously as Mrs. Phipps laughed nervously. "My dear, what a question to ask." "I'm sorry, it's just that I've got to believe that your son is, well into adulthood, and if he's living beyond his means, I don't think you should—" The young woman jumped as the tip of Mrs. Phipps' cane jabbed the floor. "No!" "I apologize," the woman said quickly. "It's not my place—" She winced as the cane cracked down again. "No!" There was a fraught silence, the young woman looking between Mrs. Phipps and Andrews. The grandfather clock ticked relentlessly from a dim corner of the room. Finally, the young woman took a deep breath. "Mrs. Phipps, I don't think—" "No!" The exclamation, more a cry than a word, ripped from Annalise Phipps's throat. She stood, drew the cane over her head, and smashed it down onto the table. A crystal goblet shattered, spilling water across the table and shards of glass across the room. The young woman pushed her chair back from the table so quickly that she almost sent herself over backwards. Andrews sprang forward and tried to grab the cane. "Ma'am, please." Mrs. Phipps swiped blindly behind her, catching Andrews in the elbow with the tip of the cane. He jumped back, cradling his arm. "I'm talking!" She brought the cane down again, this time connecting with the plate whose two halves left the table on different sides. "To my—" The next blow rattled the silver and sent a salt shaker rolling toward the edge of the table. "Husband!" The final blow was a glancing one and caught the vase of tulips. Water and flowers tumbled off the table and landed on the floor at the feet of the young woman. Mrs. Phipps paused to catch her breath, and Andrews quickly approached and grasped the cane. "Ma'am, please don't distress yourself." Mrs. Phipps hitched a breath, looked toward the empty chair at the head of the table, and burst into tears. There, ma'am," said Andrews, taking the cane and lowering her into her chair. "It's all right." Mrs. Phipps dropped her face into her hands, sobs racking her body. The young woman stood, watching with wide eyes. "I'm sure that Mr. Phipps has something useful to say about Roger." He looked pleadingly at the young woman. She sank back down onto her chair. The clock marked time. Finally, she spoke. "It's me, my dear." "My love," said Andrews sotto voce. "My love," amended the young woman. Mrs. Phipps took a gulp of air, and without raising her eyes, said, "Really?" "Yes, really," said the young woman, deepening her voice slightly. Mrs. Phipps looked up at the empty chair at the head of the table. "You're here?" "Yes, I'm here, and I'm so glad we have this opportunity to talk about Roger. I don't want you facing such a difficult situation by yourself." Mrs. Phipps gave a weak smile. "I'm so relieved. And I'm so sorry to have behaved that way. I don't know what came over me." She blotted her eyes with her napkin. "Completely understandable, my love." Mrs. Phipps turned to Andrews. "I'm afraid I may have caught you with the cane, Andrews. I'm terribly sorry. Are you all right?" "Quite all right, ma'am." "Why don't you tell me what Roger's been up to?" said the young woman. "Yes, my dear, I'm anxious to get your advice." And Mrs. Phipps unburdened herself to her husband about the trials and tribulations of dealing with their oldest son, the unwise investments, the profligate spending, and unsuccessful marriage, his third, that would no doubt result in another costly alimony payment. The young woman at the side of the table sympathized, made helpful, although Andrews noted appreciatively not too specific suggestions, and congratulated Mrs. Phipps on her sensitive handling of the difficult matters. Eventually, the clock struck 8, and Mrs. Phipps heaved a relieved sigh and stood. Andrews was at her side in a moment with the cane. "I can't tell you how much this conversation has meant to me, my dear," she said. "I feel so much better prepared to deal with whatever Roger may get up to next." "You're doing wonderfully, my love," said the young woman. Mrs. Phipps took the cane from Andrews and looked down at the mess of smashed food and broken crystal at her place. "Andrews, I'm afraid I've made quite a mess of your lovely dinner, but I'm sure it would have been excellent as always." "May I bring a snack up to your room, ma'am?" "Oh, no, thank you. I'm fine for this evening." She turned toward the head of the table. "I miss you so much, my dear." "And I miss you too, my love." "I remember exactly where I was standing on our wedding day, when you told me you would always be with me on our anniversary, on Valentine's Day. And even with all the traveling you had to do, you always were." "Yes, even now." "Yes, even now." "Until next year, then?" The young woman hesitated only briefly. "Yes, my love, until next year." Mrs. Phipps tapped her way to the door, leaning on her cane barely at all. She turned at the door, blew a kiss off her twisted fingers toward the head of the table, and disappeared into the hallway, the tap of her cane receding toward the conservatory. The young woman stood and followed Andrews wordlessly down the hall toward the foyer. He pulled her coat from the closet behind the screen and held it up for her. It took her a few tries to get her arm into the coat sleeve. As she buttoned the coat, he drew an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "Please accept this small token of Mrs. Phipps's appreciation." She buried her hands in the pockets of her coat. "But I didn't do anything. Her husband wasn't there." "I'm sure Mrs. Phipps would want you to have this for taking the time to come by this evening." Her hands stayed in her pockets. "People pay me to see the dead and sometimes to speak with them. It doesn't always work. Sometimes the people aren't there, or sometimes they're there and I can't see them or can't communicate with them. In any case, I don't charge for—" She hesitated. "Well, for pretending." "Please, she's—" He cleared his throat. "You've been a tremendous help." She took the envelope reluctantly and stuffed it into her pocket without looking at it. "Next year at the same time, miss?" There was a long pause. Then finally she said, "Yes, all right." "Thank you, miss." She nodded. He opened the door for her, letting a cold breeze into the foyer. She stepped outside, her foot finding a puddle that had managed to form even under the protection of the porte-cochere. He must see to the hole in the roof, he thought. She climbed into her car, and Andrew stood at the entrance until she had passed through the rusting metal gates and turned onto the main line street. Then he stepped into the relative warmth of the foyer and closed and locked the door behind him. He went to the small room off the kitchen that he used as his office and where he kept the notebook in which he recorded appointments. He flipped forward 12 pages, 1 month per page, then noted in an unsteady, crabbed hand, February 14th, 6:30 to 8 p.m. Anne Kinnear. The end. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed All Deaths Endure by Matty Dalrymple. You can follow her on Twitter at Matty Dalrymple or on Facebook, Matty.Dalrymple, or check out her website, mattydalrymple.com, and all those links will be in the notes. If you're enjoying Pocket Pulp, please subscribe, rate, share, all that good stuff. Also, check us out on Facebook, where hopefully eventually we'll be having some lives with writers, which would be cool. Or maybe I can record live. Who knows what's going to happen. If you're a writer and you would like to have your story featured on Pocket Pulp, contact us at pocketpulpsubmission@gmail.com. My name is Eric Brian Moore, Eric with a C, Brian with a Y, and you can follow me on Twitter at Eric Brian Moore, or check out my website, ericbrianmoore.com. Music by Blue Mount Score and Eternal Producer from Pixabay. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to reading you another fantastic story next week.